Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 387 for July 29th, 2024. Got a news show for you today. Plenty to talk about. Before I get into the rundown, a couple quick notes. First of all, the DEF CON free ticket winner has been notified, and I found out that the first winner actually had a family thing come up and can't make it, so I have now notified the second winner, and I'm waiting here confirmation. Hopefully by the time this comes out, that will all be settled. Thanks to everybody who entered. I know it's kind of a weird niche thing. You have to be willing and able to go to Las Vegas on short notice. I get that. But I'm glad we got some entrants, and looking forward to maybe meeting the winner in Vegas. Looks like AT&T supposedly paid a hacker $373,000 to delete the stolen customer data. I would have made that a full-fledged article, and there was one about this, but honestly, that's about all you need to know, because despite the fact that they supposedly had a video of the hacker deleting the data, they could have easily made copies, and those copies could already be out there. There's no real way to know that's been deleted, so you should assume that data is still out there. But it is interesting, at least from a news standpoint, that AT&T did pay this person to delete the data. Actually, there was a middleman involved that brokered the deal who took a cut of that as well. It's an amazing situation. It is a full-fledged business, unfortunately, and it's got all the trappings of regular business deals. So we have a new show for you today. First, we're going to talk about how Google has given up on its plan to ditch third-party cookies. I am shocked, I say. Got a couple stories today from 404 Media, which should not be a surprise. The first one is about how the Heritage Foundation claims to have used location data to track former President Trump's shooters movements. Then I've got a story about President Trump's current choice for VP, JD Vance, about his Venmo account, which he left public. And so, again, I try to avoid politics on this show, and these stories are not going to have a political slant to them at all. It's just that these are the people who happen to be involved in these stories. And then another one, at least tangentially related to the shooting, and that is because the law enforcement agents managed to break into the would-be assassin's phone. And 404 Media has a story about some documents that were leaked that shows what the company who did that, or we're pretty sure who did that, called Cellebrite, documents that have claims about what phones they can and cannot break into currently. And I found that very interesting. Meta has taken down thousands of Facebook and Instagram accounts that were running sextortion scams. And then finally, for the news, we're going to dig into the whole CrowdStrike outage and otherwise debacle that happened just over a week ago and caused so much havoc at airports and hospitals and all sorts of places around the globe. We're going to dig into what happened there and what lessons we should be taking away from that. And then finally, I've been waiting to do this series of tips of the week and blog articles about deleting your data online. I was waiting to talk to Jason from Intel Techniques first, which we did last week. And so I have now embarked on trying to delete the bulk of my data from data brokers and people's search sites, and I'm going to share what I found with you in hopes that you could do the same for yourself. So, lots to talk about today. Let's get to it. Okay, first up, this is from Apple Insider, and I think we all saw this coming. I certainly saw it coming, so it's no surprise. But Google has decided to abandon its plan to ditch support for third-party cookies. And the article says, 4 years after declaring it wanted to block third-party cookies in Chrome, Google has confirmed it won't block the online trackers after all. In 2020, around the time when Apple blocked third-party cookies in Safari, Google insisted it would do the same thing. 4 years later, Google has seemingly given up on blocking them. A blog post from Google VP Anthony Chavez about the Privacy Sandbox, published on last Tuesday, says that the plan is moving in a different direction. This is a quote from Chavez, quote, "Instead of deprecating third-party cookies, we would introduce a new experience in Chrome that lets people make an informed choice that applies across their web browsing, and they'd be able to adjust that choice at any time. We're discussing this new path with regulators and will engage with the industry as we roll this out," unquote. The Post explains that Google received feedback from many different parties, including the UK's Competition and Markets Authority and Information Commissioner's Office, as well as online publishers and standards groups. The feedback helped Google make solutions for a competitive and thriving marketplace and encouraged the use of privacy-enhancing technologies. Privacy Sandbox, Google's APIs as part of its privacy plan, were apparently promising in testing with the potential to improve as more in the industry adopted their use. However, this also meant that quote-unquote significant work was needed by many participants, and it would impact online publishers and the online advertising market in general. Google's intentions for Privacy Sandbox, which was meant to block third-party cookies, had trouble from the outset. A year after starting work on it, Google said that the initiative would have to be delayed since more time is needed across the ecosystem to get this right. By 2022, Google gave up on a plan called Flock, or Federated Learning of Cohorts. Rather than cookies, an in-browser algorithm would analyze the user's browsing history to work out their interest cohort. The idea would put the user into a group of thousands of people with similar interests who would be targeted en masse by advertisers instead of individually. That same year, rival browser Firefox joined Safari in controlling cross-site browser cookies under a feature called Total Cookie Protection. The change meant yet another browser had beaten Chrome to the cookie punch. Google also faced intense pressure from the advertising industry over the plan. In January of 2022, a group of publishers and advertisers in Germany complained to the EU competition chief to investigate Google's cookie blocking proposal. And a quick quote from that complaint: Google must respect the relationship between publishers and users without interfering. While the old plan of blocking third-party cookies is now dead, it remains to be seen exactly what Google's new plan for Chrome will be. Whatever it turns out to be, it's almost certain there will be pushback from an industry keen to know everything about their advertising audiences. So again, it's important to understand here that Google's Chrome browser dominates the market. It is by far the most popular browser worldwide, even though on just about every platform you can think of, it comes with a default browser built in, and people still give up on that and go to Chrome. I mean, Chrome is a nice browser, don't get me wrong. Feature-wise, it's great. Even security-wise, it's pretty good. It's just a privacy nightmare. And I've been on a campaign to get my listeners and my readers to use anything else, preferably something like Brave or Firefox, or Safari if you're a Mac-only user. Anyway, Google is a huge, huge company whose vast majority of revenues come from advertising, like 80 or 90%. And so all the products they make and give away for free are there in furtherance of that business objective. And so Google had this plan, which honestly has some merit, believe it or not. But at the end of the day, they would have controlled this new form of advertising data gathering. And that's probably why some of the anti-competitive things in the EU got brought up. And a lot of these companies are just really used to having all of this information and are not willing to give that up. So anyway, you can control this. If you use any other browser besides Chrome, and if you install privacy plugins like uBlock Origin and or EFF's Privacy Badger, which, by the way, I think just recently put out an article saying that they are going to be turning Privacy Sandbox off by default for anybody with that plugin installed. You could block all the third-party cookies and all these other stupid technologies that are trying to track you. All right, this is from 404 Media, and these next few stories are all related to the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. Again, this is not going to be political at all, and it really honestly just shows why all of these security and privacy issues are nonpartisan issues. So while I'm going to be saying their names, none of this has to do with politics. The Oversight Project, a part of the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, claims to have used mobile ad location data to map the movements of Thomas Matthew Crooks in the lead-up to his attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump earlier this month. The organization, which has authored a blueprint for a second Trump term called Project 2025, claims to have used the data to find devices that are linked to Crooks, perhaps his own device or those of people he knows, and follow where he went over time. The claims demonstrate the power of mobile ad location data, which can be harvested by the location data industry through advertisements placed in apps or by code included in the apps themselves to find specific people or their associates. Access to this data, as the Heritage Foundation shows, is not limited to governments, academics, or the location industry itself, but it's also available to political operatives or other third parties. The Heritage Foundation's claims also signal a continuing shift in the treatment of mobile ad data. Once a dirty secret of the data industry, organizations are now publicly acknowledging and broadcasting their alleged use of the sensitive information and openly admitting using it in an attempt to track down individuals. The Oversight Project did not respond to a request for comment asking to share the raw data for verification purposes, nor to a question about how it sourced the information, be that from someone who leaked it or by purchasing it from a location data company. But generally, location data sourced from smartphones can include the device's precise latitude and longitude, a timestamp of that location, and the device's advertising identifier. This is a unique pseudonymous code that is linked to each device and is what allows the advertisers and industry to build a profile on a particular device and, by extension, user. Often, location companies will insist that their data is anonymous because the advertising identifier does not include a person's name or phone number. That, of course, is not true. Time and time again, researchers and journalists have shown that it's possible to de-anonymize location datasets by looking at where those devices repeatedly return to. In this case, the Oversight Project claims it tracked devices, quote, that regularly visited both Crook's home and place of work and followed them, unquote. Even if the data only included advertising identifiers, pinpointing devices that visited Crook's home could reveal his phone or those of associates. The Oversight Project then goes on to highlight the movements of various devices in the dataset. Without obtaining the raw data or other corroborating information, it's not possible to know the veracity of these claims. The Oversight Project's actions are similar somewhat to those of the Catholic Substack publication The Pillar, which in 2021 used Grindr location data to out a priest as gay without his consent. Location data has also been used by a more explicitly political project too. 2000 Mules, a film released in 2022, used location data to make the unverified claim that Democratic ballot mules were paid to illegally collect and drop off ballots, the Associated Press reported in its own debunking of the film. I've also repeatedly shown that location data companies have advertised data related to abortion clinics and their visitors. Multiple companies stopped after I reported on their practices. Okay, now I fully realize that there's a lot of politically related things in that article, but the takeaway is completely nonpartisan here. The point is that this data is out there. It's out there in support of advertising, and it's being collected by lots of different individual companies and data brokers and devices and being collected and collated and sold. And basically what this shows is that this group said, hey, let's see if we can track this guy, found a source for the cell phone location data that did not include this person's name, but if you get enough data for a certain area with timestamps, you can say, show me all the phones that were in this area, and then show me all the phones that were also near this person's home. And that's going to significantly weed through a lot of that data. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people at that rally where Trump was shot. But if you take all the phones that were at that location at that time and then cross-reference that with where Crooks lived, and then maybe if you also knew where he worked and did the intersection of those sets of data, I bet you could pretty quickly get down to one or two phones. And apparently that's exactly what they did. And even though there was no name associated with that ID, it's pretty easy to figure out who that person was. And then once you know that the ID you found there is the shooter's ID, now you can go again back through all the location data and find out where else that person went. Now, this is not law enforcement doing this, which though I am sure that they are doing very similar investigations on this guy. This is just a group of regular everyday people. And if they can do it, anyone can do it. We got some more privacy stories. Let's move on to this next one from 9to5Mac. A report on JD Vance, Trump's pick for the VP ticket, is the latest pointer to a continuing privacy fail in which Venmo connections and transactions are public by default. A major Venmo privacy failing was first highlighted by a security researcher back in 2018. Anyone can track a Venmo user's purchase history and glean a detailed profile, including their drug deals, eating habits, and arguments, because the payment app lacks default privacy protections. And that was a quote from another article written by, I guess, a female author, because the article goes on to say, this allowed her to see a complete transaction history for anyone who hadn't actively changed their settings from public to private. The publicly visible data even includes the message sent with the payment. Far from apologizing and fixing the problem, the PayPal-owned company doubled down, claiming that it was a feature, not a bug. And this is a quote from Venmo. Quote, we make it default because it's fun to share information with friends in the social world. We've seen that people open up Venmo to see what their family and friends are up to, unquote. or, anyone you may wish to cyberstalk. Vance is the latest public figure to learn this the hard way. Wired reports that his Venmo connections are potentially embarrassing to the candidate, and this is some quotes from the Wired report. His public Venmo account gives an unfiltered glimpse into his extensive network of connections with establishment GOP heavyweights. And for those of you outside the U.S., GOP is the Grand Old Party, which is another name for the Republican Party. Wealthy financiers, technology executives, the prestige press, and fellow graduates of Yale Law School, precisely the elites he rails against. Vance has frequently positioned himself as anti-elite, writing in Hillbilly Elegy, that's a book he wrote, quote, "Sometimes I view members of the elite with an almost primal scorn," unquote. In an April post on X, or Twitter, Vance, who graduated Yale Law School in 2013, condemned quote-unquote elite universities, calling them expensive daycare centers for coddled children. His network is largely made up of attorneys, the vast majority of whom received their law degree from Yale Law around the same time he did. So that's the end of what I'm taking from the first 9 to 5 article. But that article linked to another article which has another interesting point in it. So I want another Wired article. Let me read a snippet of that. Being friends on Venmo does not mean two people have transacted together or even know the payment app has designated them as friends. According to Venmo, when someone first uses the app, they are prompted to allow it to access their phone contacts. If they agree, Venmo will find any contacts already using the app and automatically populate the user's friend list. Users can also intentionally add or remove friends. Along with their users' transactions, their friends list is public by default. This means it's likely that Vance's list of friends was largely populated by the contacts in his phone when he set up his account in December of 2016. Wired verified the senator's account through its connections to his wife, Usha Vance, as well as actors or producers in the 2020 film adaptation of his 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. In total, Vance is connected directly to 211 people. Okay, again, this is about JD Vance. I realize he is the current VP nominee for the Republican Party of the United States. This has nothing to do with the fact that he's a Republican. This has everything to do with privacy and why I always tell anybody who will listen not to use Venmo. I do believe they have finally made transactions private by default, or at least only visible to friends or contacts by default. But as you can see here, quote unquote friends, if you've given the app access to your phone book, means everybody you know, everybody who's in there. Is everybody currently in your contact list a friend? I don't know about you, but my contact list includes a lot of contractors like handymen and plumbers, people at my bank, my doctor, basically anyone that I want to be able to know who they are when the phone rings and not have my phone block them. Those are not necessarily people I would want to be able to see every one of my Venmo transactions. So I realize Venmo is a very popular app. If you do insist on using it, make sure you go through all the privacy settings and make all of your transactions as private as possible. If you're willing to try something else, if you are in the Apple ecosystem, Apple Cash and Apple Pay are pretty darn private. If you need to go outside the Apple ecosystem, there's not a lot of great choices, to be honest. Zelle is something that is used by a lot of banks if you need to just kind of send a contractor some money or something like that. Google Pay and Samsung Pay, I mean, they've got privacy issues too. They're not as bad as Venmo. I will say, just looking ahead, that in the coming version of iOS 18, which should be out here in another couple months, Apple Cash will now have the ability to give money to just someone who's standing next to you. You can just tap your phones together. You don't have to enter their name or anything. There's 100% privacy. You can basically just pass digital money from your phone to their phone just by putting your phones next to each other. But however, that would require somebody with a modern iPhone running the latest operating system. So anyway, I guess the bottom line is try not to use Venmo. If you do, make sure you make everything as private as possible. Don't share it with all your friends. Curate your list of friends. If you just gave them a list of your contacts when you installed the app, you might want to go through and remove anybody that is not a friend or someone that you would need to Venmo. As always, with any of these digital payments, treat it just like cash, because once that money is gone, it is gone. But unlike cash, the provider that is doing that transaction at least knows everything about that transaction and may be selling that information to other people. All right, let's keep going. One more story here from 404 Media, and yes, it is related to the attempted assassination, but only tangentially, because this is something we should all be aware of. Again, this is 404 Media. Cellebrite, the well-known mobile forensics company, was unable to unlock a sizable chunk of modern iPhones available on the market as of April 2024, according to leaked documents verified by 404 Media. The documents, which also show what various Android handsets and operating system versions Cellebrite can access, provide granular insight into the very recent state of mobile forensic technology. Mobile forensics companies typically do not release details on what specific models their tools can or cannot penetrate, instead using vague terms in marketing materials. The documents obtained by 404 Media, which were given to customers but not published publicly, show how fluid and fast-moving the success or failure of mobile forensics tools can be, and highlights the constant cat-and-mouse game between hardware and operating manufacturers like Apple and Google, and the hacking companies looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. Analysis of the documents also comes after the FBI announced it had successfully gained access to the mobile phone used by Thomas Matthew Crooks, the suspected shooter in the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. The FBI has not released details on what brand of phone Crooks used, and it has not said how it was able to unlock his phone. The documents are titled Cellebrite iOS Support Matrix and Cellebrite Android Support Matrix, respectively. An anonymous source recently sent the full PDFs to 404 Media, who said they'd obtained them from a Cellebrite customer. Graphene OS, a privacy and security-focused Android-based operating system, previously published screenshots of the same documents online in May, but the material did not receive wider attention beyond the mobile forensics community. So if you're really curious about whether your phone could be hacked by Cellebrite, listen closely to the rest of this story. I'm going to go through the details. For all locked iPhones able to run iOS 17.4 or newer, the Cellebrite document says, in research, meaning they cannot necessarily be unlocked with Cellebrite's tools. For previous iterations of iOS 17, stretching from 17.1 to 17.3.1, Cellebrite says it does support the iPhone XR and iPhone 11 series. And by the way, we're currently on 15 and about to go to 16, so these were several years old. Specifically, the document says Cellebrite recently added support to those models for its supersonic brute force capability, which claims to gain access to phones quickly. But for the iPhone 12 and up running those operating systems, Cellebrite says support is quote-unquote coming soon. The iPhone 11 was released in 2019. The iPhone 12 was launched the following year. In other words, Cellebrite was only unable to unlock iPhones running the penultimate version of iOS that were released nearly 5 years ago. The most recent version of iOS in April 2024 was 17.4.1, which was released in March of 2024. Apple then released 17.5.1 in May. According to Apple's own publicly released data from June, the vast majority of iPhone users have upgraded to iOS 17, with the operating system being installed on 77% of all iPhones and 87% of iPhones introduced in the last 4 years. The data does not break down what percentage of those users are on each iteration of iOS 17, though. All right, Android people, this is your part. The second document shows that Cellebrite does not have blanket coverage of locked Android devices either, although it covers most of those listed. Cellebrite cannot, for example, brute force a Google Pixel 6, 7, or 8 that has been turned off to get the user's data, according to the document. The most recent version of Android at the time of the Cellebrite documents was Android 14, released in October of 2023. The Pixel 6 was released in 2021. Cellebrite confirmed the authenticity of the documents in an emailed statement to 404 Media. Cellebrite's Android-focused document also explicitly mentions Graphene OS in 2 tables. As well as being an operating system that the privacy-conscious might use, 404 Media has spoken to multiple people in the underground industry selling secure phones to drug traffickers who said that some of their clients have moved to using Graphene OS in recent years. So a lot of things to take out of that. First of all, so maybe starting in reverse order. Graphene OS is based on Android. The Android base operating system is open source, and there have been groups that have taken the base Android code and forked that project, made a copy of it, and built a new Android-based OS on top of that. In this case, Graphene OS. There are others. One is called Calyx. With the point being that they are de-Googled versions of Android, basically, and usually with a lot of other security and privacy stuff layered on, because one of the main reasons that anybody would go to the trouble of removing the Google-based Android OS from their phone would probably be to enhance their privacy. But to summarize the whole notion of this article, Cellebrite is a company that does mobile forensics, which is a fancy way of saying they break into phones. They do it oftentimes for law enforcement, as in the case here where they have a shooter who's dead and they take that shooter's phone and they want to get as much information off that phone as possible, but almost all modern phones are encrypted and locked, and you're not supposed to be able to get in there. That's the whole privacy aspect of this. That's something that you and I are counting on when we buy these phones and they say that they're secure, and that's why we, use Face ID and fingerprint ID and PIN codes and full disk encryption on these devices, because we don't want a bad guy to get our phone and be able to get all this information off of it. But this company, Cellebrite, and there are others that do this, but they're one of the most popular, their whole reason for being, their raison d'etre, is to break into phones. So they are doing the cybersecurity work to try to figure out vulnerabilities in these phones that will let them bypass those locks and that encryption to get at the contents of somebody's phone against the phone owner's wishes. But according to this, Apple has done a pretty darn good job lately of securing their phones to the point where basically any modern phone running the latest version of iOS is something they cannot currently get into. So the speculation then is that the shooter had an Android phone because they were able to get into that phone in about 40 minutes. I think it was a Samsung phone, which is an Android-based phone. And according to these documents, which is marketing materials from Cellebrite that were leaked, Android phones are less secure, though the Google series phones, the Pixel phones, seem to be pretty secure as long as not only are they locked, but they are powered off. So if they're locked but still powered on, like you could just wake it up and it says, give me your PIN code, apparently Cellebrite still has figured out a way to hack into that phone, potentially by brute forcing the PIN code, plugging it in and have a computer try every possible PIN code to get into that phone. There are supposed to be built-in limits to that, like you can't do that more than 10 times without it shutting down or wiping the phone or making you wait longer and longer periods before you can enter another code, which would slow you down to the point where, 40 minutes wouldn't be long enough. So some of these tools have figured out ways around that by resetting the counter. Like you failed 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and then reset. Oh, you've only failed once. Try again. Or perhaps finding some way to short circuit the waiting time between erroneous guesses. Anyway, one last comment on this if you're interested in this at all. Moxie Marlinspike, who is the coding genius behind Signal, the original version, he has since gone on. But it's several years ago, managed to get a hold of one of these Cellebrite hacking tools and did a very, very interesting and funny article about how they basically beefed up Signal to be Cellebrite proof and kind of booby-trapped Signal for Cellebrite. If you're interested at all, there's a link in the show notes. Check out that article. It's quite the interesting read. I've wanted to interview Moxie Marlinspike for a long time, and I've tried to reach him, but I don't think he wants to be reached. All right, next up, a short one here from the Washington Post, and it's some welcome good news. Meta said Wednesday that it has taken down about 63,000 Instagram accounts in Nigeria running sexual extortion scams and has removed thousands of Facebook groups and pages that were trying to organize, recruit, and train new scammers. Sexual extortion, or sextortion, involves persuading a person to send explicit photos online and then threatening to make the images public unless the victim pays money or engages in sexual favors. Recent high-profile cases include 2 Nigerian brothers who pleaded guilty to sexually extorting teen boys and young men in Michigan, including one who took his own life, and a Virginia sheriff's deputy who sexually extorted and kidnapped a 15-year-old girl. There has been a marked rise in sextortion cases in recent years, fueled in part by a loosely organized group called the Yahoo Boys, operating mainly out of Nigeria, Meta said. It added that it applied its dangerous organizations and individuals policy to remove Facebook accounts and groups run by that group. In January, the FBI warned of a huge increase in sextortion cases targeting children. The targeted victims are primarily boys between the ages of 14 to 17, but the FBI said any child can become a victim. Meta says its investigation found that the majority of the scammers' attempts did not succeed and mostly targeted adult men in the U.S., but added that it did see some try to target minors, which Meta says it reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. The removed accounts included a coordinated network of about 2,500 accounts linked to a group of about 20 people who are running them, Meta said. Antigone Davis, Meta's global head of safety, said users should look out for messages from people with highly stylized photos, people who are exceptionally good-looking, or have never sent you a message before. Quote, that should give you pause, unquote. Users should also take a pause if somebody sends an image first. Scammers often use this tactic to try to gain trust and bait unsuspecting people into sending them back a photo of themselves. And one final quote, she says, "This is one of these areas where if you have any sort of suspicion, I urge caution," unquote. So it's great to hear that some progress was made on this. This is a horrible, horrible scam. Some other versions of this scam are, and this was really popular years ago, where somebody would send you an email saying, "I have hacked into your computer and I see what you're up to." I've gotten one of these before myself, one or two of these at least. And they're really kind of snarky. They're like, I see the kind of things you're into and it's pretty weird. I've watched you watch porn. And to prove that they have hacked into your accounts, they will give you one of your old passwords. And then they will go on to say, "Look, I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I just want to forget about this. Tell you what, send me this much money and I will delete this stuff and you will never hear from me again." Now, the way those scams work is they have gotten your password probably from some data breach where the passwords were decrypted. It's not the right word. They were figured out from the hashes, which probably meant you had a bad password to begin with. So yeah, it might look shocking to have somebody send you an email out of the blue and show you one of your old passwords. But it's a total scam. It is not real. Just delete it and move on with your life and forget about it. Unfortunately, the kind of sextortion that this one is talking about is a bit different. So again, if somebody contacts you out of the blue, someone you don't know, don't believe anything they say about who they are, the pictures they're sending you. They're probably not them. And whatever you do not send explicit messages or pictures to them, because that's what they're trying to get you to do. And once they get enough that they think they could use for blackmailing you, they will do just that. So good news that Meta has taken at least some of these big offenders off the table. Okay, let's talk about this whole CrowdStrike debacle. I could read a news article about it, but I'm going to talk to you about it, tell you in my words what we know so far, and it's still evolving, but CrowdStrike has been putting out updates on what's happened. I think we got a pretty clear idea of what happened there, and I'm going to explain it. And then I'm going to wrap up with some other lessons I think we should take away from this whole thing. So CrowdStrike is a security company. They actually make really good products from what I can tell. They've been very popular for many years. They basically run fancy antivirus and intrusion detection systems for companies, for corporate computers, which is why when all this stuff went down, this wasn't affecting regular people at home with Windows PCs. This was affecting companies that use CrowdStrike security software on their important systems. And in particular, the ones that were running Windows operating system. And the way CrowdStrike works is really kind of interesting, honestly. It's pretty smart. The crowd part of CrowdStrike is that they crowdsource their threat intelligence. So basically all of their devices that are all over the world are talking with each other so that if something bad starts happening somewhere, the rest of the devices can learn from those devices and make adjustments, which is pretty darn cool. However, what happened last week was that CrowdStrike, because the landscape for malware and other online threats is constantly changing, the way they keep everybody up to date to make sure that they've got the latest and greatest signatures is maybe one way to put this, or heuristics, lists of things that you should be watching out for and being wary of. The way they do that is they have to keep publishing updates to all of their protected systems with this updated data. Like, okay, here's the latest on what's happening out there and the things you should be looking for. Maybe you should be blocking all requests from this IP address because we've determined that it is a bad guy. Or be looking for these certain indicators of compromise or these patterns of attacks. These are all the kind of things that these systems are doing in the background to try to protect these critical systems from malware. And so they are constantly pushing out these kind of data file updates that have descriptions of these heuristics, these rules, these algorithms, this data about what to look for, these control files. And they push them out on a regular basis. And they pushed out an update to all of their systems worldwide in a single go, an update that broke everything. There was something in this file that caused a software error in their interpreter for that file. Like these files get sent out and then they get read and try to get incorporated into what that system is looking out for. And in the process of reading through this file, there was something corrupt or wrong. I've yet to see a good description of what actually happened there. But there was something that caused the software to crash. And I've read through the most recent reports on this. CrowdStrike says that they've got what they call exception handling built into the code, which should mean that anytime something really bad happens, that error is caught and dealt with before it allows the software to crash. This, for some reason, got past that. And because this is security antivirus software that particularly on Windows PCs has its claws and tentacles deep into the operating system. This is happening at boot time. When the system comes up, when the system got this update and read it, caused it to crash, and on reboot would not boot. So all of these systems wouldn't even come up. You couldn't even log into them. They were just constantly dying. So it turns out that all you needed to do to fix this, I make it sound easy. In practice, it wasn't actually that easy. But you basically had to find this special data file that was sent out, a very particular file with a particular name in a particular place. You had to boot that PC into safe mode so that it wouldn't run this software, and you could actually get a prompt in a window and you could actually do something with it. Find this file and delete it, and then restart, and everything would be fine. CrowdStrike had already updated the version of the file. Once the system finally came up and was allowed to boot normally, it would go get the fresh updated version of that file, which was fine. Unfortunately, in almost every case, that required some human to sit down at a keyboard for each affected computer and do that. Now, Microsoft, I think, did put out a little USB drive that you could plug into these affected computers to get it to do it. Nevertheless, it still took humans to go to each of these systems, and it affected 8 million PCs worldwide, which honestly is not that many if you look at the total number of Windows PCs on the planet. But that's because these were not normal PCs. These were computer systems that were running in big-time businesses that paid for CrowdStrike security services. And so that's why all these systems went down at airports and hospitals and you name it, all these big companies, and they were completely down. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, both at the kind of the micro level here with what happened at this specific incident and with this specific company. But then we need to back up and also be looking at things at a higher level. And these are lessons we need to be learning. This is not the first time this has happened. I mean, look back at SolarWinds and some of the Colonial Pipeline, and there have been other incidents that we should have been learning from. And, maybe we're just slow to implement changes, but I've got several things I want to make sure I talk about here today. First of all, CrowdStrike, as far as I know, is a reputable company. This is going to be a huge black eye for them, and they've been doing good work. But the real issue I have with them here, first of all, is their response. Their CEO put out a very tone-deaf response when this first came out. They did say some vague things like, this isn't a cyber attack and this wasn't a software glitch. It was due to an update that we sent out that caused the problem. We've got it fixed. We're rolling it out. We're helping our customers, yada, yada, yada. And specifically, the CEO initially, in the initial response, didn't take any blame really or say they were sorry. Later on, he did, but that was a little bit late. Second, this should have been tested a lot better before it was rolled out. Obviously, they missed it. They said they do have testing in place, that they're testing. There was a glitch in their test system that missed this particular problem. Obviously, they're going to fix that. But the other key thing that they should have done here that they didn't, and this is really best practice for a lot of software update rollouts, and maybe the problem here is that this was really not a software update. It was like a data file update. But we should follow the same procedures, and that is there should be a controlled, incremental rollout of changes to your customer base. Instead of just sending this to all your computers immediately at the same time, you should be sending it out incrementally to a small group and a slightly larger group and a slightly larger group. And then once all that goes well, then you can roll it out to everybody. They even have a name for those first systems. They're called canary systems, like canary in a coal mine. These are usually companies that have agreed to be at the bleeding edge and say, yes, we will help you test this. We've got a special relationship with you where we know we're going to get the stuff hot off the presses, but we think that we want to get these security updates as quickly as possible. And there's usually a special service level agreement and setup for those kind of systems. But they basically agree to say, okay, yeah, test it on us first and let's see what happens. And then as that works, and when you roll out to the canary systems, they all work just fine. Then you go a little bit further and eventually you roll it out to everybody. You don't do it all at once. So unless we learn something differently, I don't think this was malicious. I don't think there's any like one, low-level support engineer that needs to be fired for this. And in fact, there's really probably no one person that should be fired except maybe the CEO. Because at the end of the day, this was a systemic failure. This is a lot of people not following best practices. This should not have been allowed to happen. There should be no way for one person at a company to cause a massive outage like this. But there's a lot of other lessons we should be taking from this at a higher level. First of all these systems should have been much more robust to begin with. Security is something we do not spend enough money on. It's real easy to cut these costs and think you're saving money until an incident like this happens and you realize the true cost of not having secure systems and robust and resilient systems. I used to work in the telecom industry, and we had a 5 nines rule, which is 99.99% of the time, these systems had to be up. Phones were critical infrastructure, and the government had regulations on these companies that said, if you're going to provide this service, it needs to be rock solid. And if not, you're going to be fined a lot of money. And because those financial incentives were aligned that way, we had really super duper robust systems. When we upgraded a major system in the telecom industry, it was something that was done at 2 or 3 in the morning when hopefully everyone's asleep and not using the phone system. The specialized computers that ran the software we had 2 fully redundant sides, that an active side and an inactive side. And the inactive side was a hot standby. So if the primary went down for any reason, it could immediately switch over to the backup side and pick up all the calls, often without dropping them, and go on its merry way until somebody could come in and figure out what was going on with the first side. Furthermore, when there was a software update, we did it in the middle of the night, as I said, and if at any point anything went wrong with that update, so the system would keep running on the current software update, while the second side was disconnected, so they were now out of sync, so that you could upgrade the software on the second one, migrate all the data over, and then you could bring that up, test it briefly to see if it works, and if so, you could copy the new software onto the other side, and both sides are now in sync and back into this hot standby mode. But if anything it went wrong at any point during that process, you just abandon that and bring the second side back in sync with the older version, and it goes back to running, and you figure out what the problem was, and you try again later. I realize that these are just Windows PCs that probably somebody bought off the shelf, but for these critical systems, we need to be thinking about having hardware and software redundancy with backups, with hot standbys and backups for situations like this, so that if this ever happens again, you can go to the standby and until you figure out what's wrong with the primary. That's going to cost money, and it's going to cost, people taking care of that. But I'm guessing it's going to be a lot cheaper overall than dealing with these problems that are inevitably going to come up. Also, these businesses need to have backups for their data and their systems, and they need to be testing for outages like this, what we call tabletop scenarios, where they do drills on outages like this and how they're going to work around it. And if they've got to go to paper, what do they do? Particularly critical things like hospitals and healthcare. And finally, this is just another example of supply chain issues. There are a lot of companies today that no one's ever heard of, at least people like you and me have never heard of, that have gotten into very privileged and important positions among multiple important companies and infrastructure, that if they have a problem, all of a sudden it impacts a lot of things all at once. We talk about the software bill of materials, or SBOM, when it comes to software, because there's a lot of software dependencies that are supply chain issues. But there's also infrastructure and other service provider supply chain issues like this, where there are dependencies that need to be surfaced so that we can make sure there's not single points of failure and have backup systems where necessary. We just cannot keep going like we are now. There's not enough financial or legal liability for these kind of problems to force companies to make the right financial decisions and invest in robustness and resiliency and security. Now, one more quick comment I want to make on these sorts of events in general. Whenever there's a big event like this, scammers will come out of the woodwork. There's already been cases of people claiming to be from CrowdStrike support, calling these companies and phishing them, or using that as a way to get into the company and get up to no good. There was another set of scammers that put out a fake CrowdStrike manual, and in that manual had links to malware. And there's also a lot of disinformation around stuff like this. You may have seen the article that said the Southwest Airlines escaped being affected by this because their computers were so old that they weren't affected. That was not true. The real reason they weren't affected is because they weren't running CrowdStrike. And the reason, by the way, that Windows PCs were affected by this and not Macintoshes or Linux systems was because there are protections in Mac OS and Linux as an operating system that don't let CrowdStrike get its tendrils so deep into the operating system that if things go sideways, the computer won't even boot. So that is a note for Microsoft that they might want to be changing how they allow software packages like CrowdStrike to operate on their operating system. Okay, so that is my take on CrowdStrike. Now let's get to my tip of the week. Given that we just talked to Jason from Intel Techniques about OSINT, or open source intelligence, and we've talked about a lot of personal and private information that is publicly available right now on the internet because they come from public records like property tax records, voting records, databases for professional, even sports licenses, court filings, legal filings, even things like newspaper articles. All this information is online now, and it's easy to search, and a lot of data brokers and people search sites are scouring the internet for this information, including, of course, our social media posts and things like that, and putting together dossiers on all of us and making them available for sale to just about anybody who wants to buy them. So Jason from Intel Techniques, they've got some wonderful tools on their site, and they've got a data removal guide and a workbook that you can download. You can get the link from my article on this, which lists dozens and dozens of data brokers and people search sites that might have your information. But for the most part, there's like a top 10 baddies. And if you go after that top 10, a lot of that will actually trickle down to many of the others. So we're going to focus on the top 10 here. And in that top 10, there are 2 data brokers, LexisNexis, and one called Axiom, ACXIOM, I think is how you spell it. It's funny. And then some people search sites, including things like Intellius, MyLife, White Pages, Spokio, and a really shady Russian one called Radaris, and a few others. They're all in the article, and I recommend you eventually go read that. But let me kind of just give you a rough idea of what this process is. I'm going to break this down into at least 2 steps. And the first step is going to be figuring out what data you have out there right now. We've got to do some reconnaissance. We got to do a little research. We have to understand the scope of the problem before we try to solve that problem, which is to delete or at least suppress that information where we can. So at a high level, here's the plan. Intel Techniques has a wonderful workbook that suggests that you create a little privacy journal where you keep this information. And I have actually taken the next step and given you a template for that, which you can download from my article. And I'm going to kind of walk through how I did this when I went through this process and suggest that you basically copy how I did it for organizing your information and kind of formalizing your approach to doing this. I guess before I go any further, let me just address maybe the question that is jumping out in your mind right now, I'm sure is, hey, aren't there companies that just will do this for me if I pay them money? Yes, there are. And we talked about that with Jason. And Jason's basic point was this. You really want to do this for yourself. Because think about how it's going to work if you pay someone else to do this. Basically, what's going to happen is you're going to have to give them a whole bunch of your personal data because they're going to have to use that to go out and find your data out there on the web in order to ask those companies to delete that data. So you're now having to trust yet another party with a lot of personal data. And even if they don't abuse that data in some way, that is yet just another place that has your data that could eventually be breached by a bad guy. Furthermore, these guys really are just going to automate a lot of the stuff that Intel Techniques and I'm about to describe for you how to do. Yes, they're going to do that work for you, but they've just got computers that just take your information and crank out a bunch of form letters via email or regular snail mail, and then do kind of some automated follow-up. And I can almost guarantee you that it's not going to be a completely hands-off thing. I went through this a couple of years ago when I was trying to get out of LexisNexis, and I had someone help me do this. I'm not going to get into the details of that. It was a private thing. They were testing out something that they were doing. And even so, even though they were deputized to act as my agent to do these things, there was still a lot of times when I had to personally get involved to prove that I was who I said I was, that I really wanted to delete this data, et cetera, et cetera. So even so, my guess is that you will have a similar experience where even if you pay someone else to do this, there will be some engagement that you'll have to go through anyway. And then finally, you're going to end up paying these people not once, but forever, because this data will keep kind of coming back up. So it's going to be a subscription, an ongoing cost, And at the end of the day, you really kind of need to appreciate for yourself who has your data and what data they have. You kind of need to see it yourself. And Intel Techniques has gone to all the trouble of finding the exact links that you need for each of these websites and each of these companies to request that your data is removed. So we will get to the deletion part next time. The first part is doing the reconnaissance to actually see what's out there. And I think you're going to be shocked. I was shocked. When I went through this for myself, I expected to find a good bit of information out there. There were some sites that had a scary amount of information on me, like every single address I have ever had, including like college apartments and many, many email addresses I've had over the years, including corporate ones. And then just to put the cherry on top, most of these people search sites will also say, we think this person is related to these other people. And they got most of that right. Like my daughters and my mom were listed in there. There were some other people that I was not related to, but that's beyond the point for me. I mean, with the fact that they were able to actually figure out that I was related to other people, particularly people who don't even share my last name, that was eye-opening. So briefly, here's what I did. And again, all of this is on the blog article. There's a link in the show notes. Please go read it. And it's much easier to see it, but I'm just going to tick off the top bullet points here to give you an idea. So first of all, download the workbook from Intel Techniques. I've got a link in the article. They've done a great job. It's got a lot of really good info. It's really long, but most of it's just all the multiple companies. You only really have to read like the first page or two to get their instructions. They list right there what they think the top 10 are. And again, it's those 2 data brokers I told you about and another 8 that are what we call people search sites. And so I did create a journal. Now, I did this all digitally. Jason doesn't like digital. He prefers to do this by hand, but let me explain why I like it to be done digitally. And of course, you need to be doing this on your personal computer on your home network. Don't do this at work, on a work computer. Don't do this in a public place like at the library or whatever. Because the kind of searches you're going to be doing, the data you're going to be putting on the computer is stuff you do not want someone else to get a hold of. That's kind of the whole point. So make sure you're doing all of this on your personal computer. So I actually used Proton Drive and the new Proton Docs, the document application, to do my research on this. I created a folder in Proton Drive for all my OSINT work. And then for every company in this top 10, I created a separate document. And at the top of the document, I pasted the information from the Intel Techniques guide, which has all the links and things that you need to go to the right pages for finding your information and for then eventually deleting it. So I pasted that at the top of each one. And then I basically made a journal out of it. For every day, I have a list of entries in chronological order of what I did with each company. And I actually went to each of those sites. And for the people search sites, I searched on myself. And I found the data they had on me. And what I actually did, and this is a benefit, I think, for the digital way of doing it, is I took screenshots of what I found there. It's a lot easier than trying to write it down by hand. And it also helps jog my memory a lot more when I'm going back, days later to look at these things. So I took screenshots and I pasted them into the document with my notes about, okay, I went to this and I searched on this and this is what I got. And then when I dug in deeper and clicked on this profile, this is what I found. And so I just took all these notes in kind of chronological order for each of these sites that I went to. And now I've got a nice little memory capture of everything that happened there. I also had a single high-level notes for all of them, where I could kind of keep notes about everything I found across all of them that were kind of interesting. I also had a global to-do list. So I kind of made a to-do list of these 10 companies and what the next steps were for each one. And that was all in a single document. I found that kind of easier than putting on each document, but you could do whatever makes sense for you. And then the other thing that was key to do as I went to each of these people search sites was if I found a profile that looked like me, and I could click on that link and see the profile. Of course, they redact a lot of stuff because eventually what they're going to try to do is make you pay to see it. Don't do that. Don't pay. Just get as much as you can because it's your information. The redactions really shouldn't matter to you. I mean, if they redact out part of your addresses or part of your email addresses, there should be enough there for you to recognize what they are and you know what they are. And that's all that matters. So anyway, if you do find an entry there that looks like you, click on it to go into that profile and then copy the URL of that profile or the ID if they give one, because eventually when you ask to delete it, they're going to say, okay, well, which one is you? And most of them are going to ask you to give it that link or that ID number. And that's pretty much it for the people search sites. For the data brokers, it's a little bit different. Those you're going to want to, at least I did, I wanted to request my profile from them first. They're not people search sites, so it's not really meant for individuals to go there and look up people. These are companies that sell to other companies, not really to individuals like you and I. So for LexisNexis and Axiom, what I did instead was I started off by putting in a request to see my data. So I want to get my profile from them first, and then I will eventually ask them to delete it. So in my blog article, I gave you a download link to my sample template so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It's a lot easier to kind of see the example. So you're really going to need to check out my blog article on this. Go to firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. It's probably the most recent article if you're listening to this soon, and plan to go through this. There's some other tips in there that I'm not going to get into all here, but one of the main ones is don't try to do this all at once. I did it all at once. It took me several hours, but I was kind of determined to do it. Slow and steady wins the race here, folks. Don't overburden yourself. Do a couple companies and a couple more companies and spread it out over several days or even a couple weeks. So there you go. Definitely go read the article. The next time, if not soon, I will be helping you to actually go through the process of deleting that data with a few other ideas for things you might want to follow up on. So there you have it. There's your news and your tip of the week. All right, everybody, I got a couple quick things. I went through and tabulated all the book surge results. If you're curious, you can go to the same link that I was given before, the fdsd.me/booksurge, or you can just find it on my website. At the bottom of the article that I originally wrote for this campaign, I've got a chart that shows the data over time, both before and after the surge and during. But just to summarize the results real quick, I had 27 reviews when we started. I've got 36 now. That's an increase of 33%. That's pretty good. The reviews that were posted were very kind, by the way. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who wrote those. Those are very heartwarming. And we'll do a great job, by the way, to help sell the book. So thank you very much for that. I can always use good reviews and need to be getting new ones all the time. So if you haven't done one yet, or if you buy my book in the future, know that writing a really nice 5-star review on Amazon is a huge, huge help. One of the main goals was to try to hit in the top 10 of the 3 rankings, the categories that Amazon put my book in. We got very, very close, but didn't quite get there. Everything peaked around Tuesday, which makes sense because I do have enough analytics to know that most people listen to my podcast, or at least download it within the first 36 hours or so. So that's kind of to be expected, I think. But it was kept up for most of the week, which is good. So as far as the peaks, there were 3 categories. Computer and network security, we peaked out at 13. For privacy and online safety, we peaked out at 14. And for internet and telecommunications, we peaked out at 21. So that's all pretty darn close, especially when you realize that some of these rankings, that you could see on the chart, got into the hundreds. So getting all the way up to, the teens was pretty darn good. So if you're curious to see the data, again, go to fdsd.me/booksurge and scroll all the way down to the bottom. Now, I will be doing some more awareness campaigns. Again, I'm really on this mission this year to try to reach as many new people as possible. So we've done the book now. I will probably do other campaigns for the podcast and my blog and newsletter and maybe social media. The podcast one would probably make most sense if we did that around the 400th episode, which is not too far away, right around Halloween. That'll be a big milestone. And we've got a big guest. Bruce Schneier will be coming for that show. So that would probably be a good time to do a podcast campaign. For the newsletter and the blog, maybe I'll do that in September. And for social media, we'll have to wait and see. But there will be more campaigns. So if you missed out on the book campaign, the book search campaign, there will be plenty of other opportunities. And, just if you're wanting to help support me some more, there will be more ways to do that coming up. So stay tuned. For my top patrons in the Merlin's Musings private podcast this week, I'm going to be talking about how the hackers managed to clone Ticketmaster's supposedly non-transferable tickets. Spoiler alert, they figured out how to make them transferable, and it was really quite clever. We got some great shows coming up. Next week, we'll be doing an interview with Jack Daniel, singular. He is one of the co-founders of the Security B-Sides conferences, one of which I will be attending here in Las Vegas soon. He was a very interesting old gentleman. We had some great stories. So that will be next week's interview. I thought that was rather appropriate since B-Sides is coming up shortly. And again, we'll be talking with Andy Yen from Proton. I'll be talking with Zoe McDonald from Mozilla about the privacy or lack thereof in dating apps. And I'm hoping to bring on the folks that found the tunnel vision vulnerability to talk more generally about what VPNs are and what they aren't. And hopefully I will also be finding some great new interviews with folks that I meet at Hacker Summer Camp in just about 2 weeks. So again, lots of great content coming up. You want to subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of that. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.